in pigment manufacture during that time. And it's interesting that several of the new pigments that did appear were in the autumnal colours that we associate with Rembrandt. The prevailing attitude of the connoisseurs in the early 19th century was summed up by Sir George Beaumont, who was an artist and the patron of John Constable. And he said, "A good picture, like a good fiddle, should be brown." And here is Constable being dutifully brown. I should say in Constable's defence that he's said to have protested at this idea of Beaumont's by taking a violin and placing it on grass to show just how far the colour of grass was from the colour of the violin. But you can see nevertheless that he observed this convention of toning down his colours. In fact, he was considered to be something of an innovator in colour with an unusually bright palette. And so that tells us something about how truly murky colour has become by the early 19th century. Well, let's have a look at some of these autumnal colours. For Baroque painters who liked their works dark and golden, there was a substance called Cassel earth, which was a peaty substance with a warm brown colour. Van Dyck liked it so much that it later became known, and you'll buy it today in shops, as Van Dyck brown. And then there was bitumen, which was literally what it sounds like. It was a tarry substance. It was an appalling pigment to use. They used it a lot for deep shadows, but it never dried, and it ended up ruining many 18th and 19th century paintings. And then there was a substance called Indian yellow, and this was a mysterious yellow substance that was imported from India by the Dutch originally in the 17th century, and Rembrandt used it a lot. No one knew what it was made from for a long time until in the late 19th century it was discovered that it was made from the urine of cows fed exclusively on mango leaves. But in the late 18th century, a new rainbow began to spread across the artist's palette. This was the golden age of chemistry. New elements were being discovered by the handful, and the French chemist Antoine Lavoisier was starting to make sense of the chemical transformations that occur through his discovery of the element oxygen. Now, that discovery is still somewhat contentious. Some people claim that the first person to identify oxygen was the Swedish apothecarist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who was one of the greatest experimental scientists of that time. Scheele also isolated hydrogen and barium and chlorine, which was soon used as a bleach in the dyeing industry. And in 1775, Scheele discovered a green substance while he was experimenting on arsenic compounds. This was copper arsenite, which soon became used as a green pigment called Scheele's green. And it was brighter than any of the earlier pure green pigments. But Scheele's green was itself soon eclipsed by the discovery in 1814 of a new, more attractive arsenic-based pigment, which became known in England as emerald green. Unfortunately, this, also being an arsenic compound, was also poisonous. If it was exposed to dampness, it tended to decompose to release an arsenic-containing gas. But because both of these pigments were actually quite cheap to manufacture, emerald green and Scheele's green were used not only as artists' pigments, but as household paints and on pattern wallpaper. And this made damp rooms death traps. And in the 1860s, there were fears raised in England that young children were being killed by the deadly fumes that were emanating from their bedroom walls. It's also believed that Napoleon's death in exile on St. Helena was brought on in the same way. Perhaps the most important innovations in artists' colours in the 19th century stemmed from the discovery in the late 18th century of a bright red mineral in Siberia. This was called crocoite, or Siberian red lead. And in the early 19th century, the French chemist Nicolas Louis Vauquelin investigated this material and discovered that it contained a new metallic element whose compounds were brightly coloured. And he named the new element after this property. He named it after the Greek word for colour. It's what we now know as chromium. Crocoite is a mineral form of the compound lead chromate. And when Vauquelin made this same compound, lead chromate, synthetically, he found that it had a bright yellow colour. And this became used as the pigment called chrome yellow, not just for artists' paints, but also for commercial ones. It was widely used to paint coaches, for example, which seems to kind of anticipate its use on the yellow taxi cabs in New York. Vauquelin found that he could also make a different form of lead chromate that was orange. And this was the first pure orange pigment that artists had had since poisonous realgar. And then chromium oxide was a green colour, and if you made it in a certain way so that there was some water incorporated into the crystals, this made the green even more vibrant, and this gave rise to the pigment called viridian. And these new pigments just kept coming. In 1817, a German chemist called Friedrich Strohmeyer discovered a new element called cadmium. And he found that this metal could be combined with sulfur to make bright yellow and bright orange pigments. These were cadmium yellow and cadmium orange. And then in the early 20th century, a deep red version of it became available too. This cadmium red became very popular. Matisse was particularly fond of it. And in the late 18th century, the French government considered pigment manufacture to be so commercially important that it appointed some of its leading chemists to devise new colours. So the government asked Louis-Jacques Thénard to look for a synthetic substitute for ultramarine, which was still very expensive. And in 1802, Thénard found a way to make a rich blue colour from cobalt, which became known as cobalt blue. And it was found that cobalt could give rise to several other colours too, a yellow pigment, which was called auréoline, and soon after that a purple pigment called cobalt violet, which was actually the first ever stable, reliable purple pigment that artists had ever had. A sky blue pigment made from cobalt was called cerulean blue, and this was one of the favourite colours of some of the post-impressionist painters. But what painters really wanted for their blue was just, they wanted ultramarine, but they just wanted it more cheaply. And so in 1824, the French Society for the Encouragement of National Industry offered a prize for the first person who could find a way to synthesize ultramarine. Now, ultramarine is actually a very complicated compound to make, but in 1828, so just 4 years later, a Frenchman named Jean-Baptiste Guimet claimed the prize, and that's why synthetic ultramarine was subsequently widely known as French ultramarine. So this pigment manufacture was now a big business. It wasn't any longer this cottage industry that apothecarists and alchemists would perform. And factories were set up in the 19th century to make and to grind pigments. And some of them just sold these pigments in pure form to artists' suppliers, who would then mix them up to make a paint and give them to the painters. But some pigment manufacturers, such as Reeves and Winsor & Newton in England, provided ready-made oil paints, which from the 1840s were sold in collapsible tin tubes. Either way, this meant that the painters were becoming ever less familiar with what it was that they were buying, and they had no way of assessing the quality of this profusion of new paints. And so a new breed of professional began to appear, called the colour man, who knew about the skills of the painter, but also had some chemical knowledge so that they could test the materials that were being supplied to artists. And in England, the foremost colour man of the 19th century was George Field. He supplied colours to Turner and to the Pre-Raphaelites. This is John Everett Millace's Ophelia. So it's one of the classic Pre-Raphaelite paintings. And I think the extraordinary thing about this is the greens in particular. If we just skip back to, this is Turner, this is Constable in 1838. And 15 years later, that's Millais, and that's the impact of these new synthetic colours. In fact, these colours, people had never seen colours this vibrant before, and some critics just couldn't, they were just too much for the critics to handle. Someone accused the Pre-Raphaelites of using greens that were unripe enough to cause indigestion. Well, thanks to Field, Turner was able to acquire these new colours almost as soon as they were invented, and he was amongst the first painters in England to use many of them, to use cobalt blue and emerald green and viridian and chrome yellow. This was always a gamble, because even with the assistance of someone like Field, you could never be sure that these materials weren't going to fade or discolour over time, and in fact several of Turner's paintings have suffered that way. But all the same, Turner remains one of the greatest innovators in colour, and he brought a blaze of Venetian brightness to the dour palettes of most early 19th century art. This painting in particular, this is Ulysses deriding Polyphemus, so it's depicting a scene from the Odyssey, and it was considered shocking by many contemporary critics. One of them said it was a specimen of colouring run mad. Positive vermilion, positive indigo, and all the most glaring tints of green, yellow, and purple. Another, perhaps more perceptive observer compared Turner to a Rembrandt born in India. And Turner's use of colour was an important influence on the Parisian Impressionists, such as Monet, who came to London to see his work. And the Impressionists made equally avid use of these new colours. This is a typical palette of the Impressionists. In fact, here, the reds towards the top don't fare so well. They're sort of applied rather thickly, so it doesn't give you the ideal impression of what they looked like. But in fact, of these 20 colours, 12 of them were inventions of the 19th century. 12 of them didn't exist before then. And the shock of seeing the work of the Impressionists wasn't just that of seeing a new style of painting without the clear and smooth edges favoured by the French Academy of Fine Arts, but also that of seeing colours that had never been seen before on canvas. In this picture by Renoir, Boating on the Seine, apart from the traditional lead white, there are just 7 pigments here, and all of them, apart from the reds, are these modern synthetic colours: cobalt blue in the river, viridian, chrome yellow, lemon yellow, which was another new colour, and chrome orange in the boat here. And they're applied here almost unmixed. So this is really Impressionism straight from the tube. Now, the Impressionist style shaped the early work of many of the most important painters of the modern age. Paul Cézanne began as an Impressionist, and Vincent van Gogh's work was transformed when he came to Paris to see these paintings. They gave him the inspiration to use bold, unmixed new colours with glaring brilliance, such as those in this picture, The Night Café, which was painted in 1888. This looks, I mean, you can see this is quite a different work from Impressionism. It's got these harsh dissonances in the colours. In fact, Van Gogh said of this, "I've tried to show that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad and commit a crime." And he relied on the strength of these colours to convey the passions of his visions. In a letter to his brother, Theo, he said, "I've got new ideas and I have new means of expressing what I want because better brushes will help me, and I'm crazy about those 2 colours, carmine, which probably means a synthetic red lake, and cobalt. Cobalt is a divine colour, and there's nothing so beautiful for putting atmosphere around things. Carmine is the red of wine, and it's warm and lively like wine. The same with emerald green. It's bad economy not to use these colours. The same with cadmium." So you can see how these artists were finding these colours to be a direct source of inspiration. Henri Matisse was also an Impressionist early in his career, but he later used these new pigments to even more stunning effect as the figurehead of the movement known as the Fauves, a French word meaning a wild beast, which reflected their uninhibited use of these new colours. This is a painting of Matisse's from 1905. Fauvism made colour a central constructive component of modern art. It became about colour. And Kandinsky initially also painted in this fauve style, and he went on to try to discover a universal emotional language of colour. None of this would have been possible without the development of the vibrant new pigments in the 19th century. And this explosion of colour wasn't just confined to fine art. As chemistry blossomed, it brought colour into the world at large. In 1766, the Scottish chemist William Cullen outlined the chemist's goal. He said, "Chemistry is the art of producing several artificial substances more suitable to the intention of various arts than any natural productions are. Does the dyer want a means of tinging a cloth a particular colour? Does the bleacher want a means of discharging these colours? It's the chemical philosopher who must supply these." So that was a challenge to the chemists to make these materials. And 100 years later, all of that seemed to be possible. Organic chemists had discovered how to make new dyes from the hydrocarbon materials that they found in coal tar. Coal tar was the black residue that was produced from the gas industry that was producing gas for gas lamp burning. And these new dyes engendered fashions in dress that would strike us as garish even today, I think. Women took to the streets in voluminous dresses and gowns of purple and magenta and other rich colours. The 1850s became known as the Purple Decade, and that's